The air in the Ravenshire outpost didn't just hang, it pressed. It was a thick, suffocating curtain of soot and sulfur that would have made any other high-born lady faint. But Serafina Vilcrest did not faint. She breathed it in, the acrid heat fueling a fire in her lungs that had been smouldering for 3 years. Clang! The sound of the heavy hammer meeting the glowing orange iron echoed through the hollow ribs of the derelict forge. In the capital, Serafina's hands had been celebrated for their porcelain pallor, their ability to coax delicate sonatas from a harpsichord. Now those same hands were a roadmap of survival. Scars from flying sparks crossed her knuckles like silver thread, and her palms were armored in thick, yellowed calluses. She didn't look like a duchess. She looked like a creature born of the earth and the flame. She wiped a streak of grease across her forehead, leaving a dark smear against her pale skin. Her corset, once a garment of suffocating elegance, was now a functional cage, its silk shredded and reinforced with rough leather straps to support her back against the weight of the sledge. Every strike was a rhythmic exorcism of Lucian's voice. "You are a decorative asset, Serafina," clang. "I could find a dozen girls with your face in any tavern in London," clang. She thrust the glowing rod back into the coals, pumping the bellows until the forge roared with a white-hot fury. She wasn't just making a tool. She was forging a masterpiece of legal and physical defiance. On the anvil lay a massive iron key, its bow shaped not with the Ravenshire crest, but with a phoenix rising from a bed of thorns. To the world, this outpost was her grave, the place where the ghost duchess went to wither away in the mud. To Lucian, it was a tax write-off on the edge of the empire. But as Serafina pulled the translucent, shimmering metal from the fire, the light caught a stack of heavy vellum documents tucked into a velvet-lined box near the hearth. They weren't letters of grievance or pleas for mercy. They were debt acquisitions, intercepted trade contracts, and deeds of foreclosure. The mud Lucian had thrown her into sat atop the largest untapped iron vein in the north, and for 36 months, Serafina had been digging. She looked at the key, then at her scarred, soot-stained reflection in a bucket of tempering water. The woman who had cried when Lucian brought his first mistress home was dead. The woman standing in the freezing darkness of the midnight forge was someone Lucian wouldn't even recognize. She wasn't just waiting for the empire to fall. She was building the furnace that would melt it down. The morning mist had not yet lifted when the sound of wheels on gravel shattered the silence of the outpost. It was a rhythmic, expensive sound, the heavy thud of thoroughbred hooves and the oiled purr of a carriage that cost more than the village's annual harvest. Serafina did not stand. She remained on her knees in the damp, black earth of the forge's garden patch, her fingers buried deep in the soil. Duke Lucian Ravenshire stepped from the carriage before his footman could even lower the step. He was a vision of silver and gold, his military tunic pressed to a razor's edge, the medals on his chest clinking with a soft, melodic arrogance. He paused, his lip curling in immediate distaste as he looked down at his boots crafted from the finest calfskin, now stained by a splash of Ravenshire mud. "Serafina," he said, his voice carrying the bored resonance of a man addressing a stray dog. She looked up, squinting against the pale sun. She didn't brush the dirt from her apron. She didn't tuck the loose, sweat-dampened strands of hair back into her simple braid. She simply watched him, her grey eyes as flat and cold as the anvil she had beaten the night before. "Lucian," she replied, her voice raspy from the forge's smoke, "you're early for the funeral. Is the empire already dead?" He laughed, a sharp, metallic sound that didn't reach his eyes. He began to pick his way toward her, stepping gingerly over the puddles of stagnant water and coal runoff like a cat avoiding a bath. He stopped 3 paces away, as if any closer might allow her poverty to rub off on his pristine wool sleeves. "Hardly," he snapped, reaching into his inner pocket to produce a roll of heavy, cream-colored vellum. "I've come to bring you the mercy you've so clearly lacked the sense to ask for. These are the papers of dissolution. The king has already initialed the private decree." He tossed the scroll. It landed in the wet dirt at Serafina's knees, the expensive wax seal cracking against a stone. "You've become a blight, Serafina, a soot-stained ghost haunting a ruin. I've found someone who understands the weight of the Ravenshire name, someone who doesn't smell of coal and desperation." He looked at her scarred hands, his disgust naked and sharp. "I gave you a palace, and you chose the mud. Now stay in it. You are officially replaced." Serafina looked down at the divorce papers, the ink beginning to bleed as the moisture from the earth seeped into the parchment. She felt the familiar, hot prickle of rage, but it didn't burn her. It forged her. She reached out, her mud-caked fingers leaving dark, permanent smears on the mercy he had offered. Then she looked up at him and smiled, a slow, terrifying expression that made Lucian's hand instinctively twitch toward the hilt of his ceremonial sword. "You're right, Lucian," she whispered, the smile widening. "The mud is far more honest than the palace. I think I'll keep it, all of it." Lucian didn't notice the change because he had stopped looking at her the moment the wedding bells ceased ringing. To him, the quarterly allowance he sent to the outpost was a tax, a negligible fee to keep a nuisance out of sight. He imagined her spending those coins on watered-down wine or perhaps a few yards of cheap lace to mend her fraying dignity. He never imagined that every copper was being weighed, measured, and weaponized. The transformation had begun in the candlelit dampness of the outpost cellar, where Serafina sat with a stolen ledger and a list of names. She knew the anatomy of Lucian's greed better than he did. She knew that a man who spends a fortune on golden carriage wheels inevitably neglects the men who grease them. She started with Mr. Henderson, the Duke's primary shipping clerk, a man whose daughter was dying of a fever while Lucian hosted a 10-course gala for the Austrian Archduke. Serafina hadn't sent a letter of condolence. She had sent 3 months' wages and a simple note, "Tell me where the debts are buried." One by one, the invisible men of the Ravenshire estate began to tilt their heads toward the north. The stable masters who were tired of seeing their horses overworked, the junior accountants who saw the Duke's gambling markers piling up like winter snow, and the dockworkers who watched the Duke's cargo ships rot while he chased a new mistress. Serafina didn't bribe them with promises of glory. She bribed them with the cold, hard reality of a future without Lucian. She lived on gruel and rainwater, wearing the same corset until the stays dug bloody furrows into her hips, all so she could divert her pittance into the hands of the disgruntled. Every coin she saved from her own mouth bought a piece of Lucian's foundation. She learned that the Duke had put up the Northern Iron rights as collateral for a baccarat debt in London. She learned that the very road Lucian's carriages travelled was technically owned by a holding company that had defaulted 6 months prior. By the second year, the Ghost Duchess was the largest private creditor to the House of Ravenshire, operating under the name the Black Iron Trust. Lucian had been so busy replacing her in his bed that he failed to notice she was replacing him in the ledgers. As she sat in the dirt now, watching his carriage pull away, she felt the weight of those 3 years of starvation and silence. He saw a woman who had lost everything. She saw a man who had already lost his empire. He just hadn't been served the bill yet. She picked up the muddy divorce papers, the vellum crinkling under her calloused thumb, and felt the predatory thrill of the trap finally snapping shut. The carriage returned 3 days later, draped in the excessive finery of a victory parade. This time, Lucian did not come alone. As the door swung open, a woman stepped out, wrapped in a cloud of lavender silk and fox fur that looked absurd against the jagged, grey backdrop of the ironworks. This was Lady Elara, the replacement, a woman whose skin had never known the bite of a winter wind, let alone the scorch of a forge. Lucian led her forward with a possessive hand on her waist, his eyes scanning the yard for Serafina. He found her sitting at a splintered wooden table beneath the shadow of the soot-stained eaves. "We found ourselves famished on the drive to the manor," Lucian announced, his voice dripping with a cruel, performative pity. "I thought it only right to show Elara the rustic charms of your hospitality. Surely the Ghost Duchess can spare a crust for her successor." Serafina did not rise. She gestured with a scarred hand to 2 empty, mismatched stools. "Sit," she said, her voice like grinding stone. "I have prepared exactly what the land provides." With a smirk of triumph, Lucian pulled out a stool for Elara, who wrinkled her nose at the smell of coal dust. Serafina placed 2 wooden bowls before them. Inside was a thin, grey pottage of boiled roots and salted fat, peasant food, the kind of meal that tasted of desperation. "How quaint," Elara whispered, daintily lifting a rusted spoon as if it were an ancient relic. Lucian watched Serafina, waiting for the flicker of shame, the downward cast of her eyes, as she realized how far she had fallen compared to the radiant creature at his side. But Serafina's gaze remained unnervingly steady. Beneath the table, hidden by the heavy, stained folds of her work apron, her fingers were not trembling. They were resting firmly on a leather-bound ledger, a book that weighed more than any crown. While Ilara struggled to swallow a piece of gristle, Serafina's thumb traced the entry on page 42, a £1 million buyback of the Duke's defaulted naval bonds. "Is the meal to your liking, Lucian?" Serafina asked softly. "It is a heavy thing to live on what you truly own." "It is a reminder of why I am leaving you behind, Serafina," Lucian snapped, pushing the bowl away in disgust. "You have become as common as the dirt you till. You represent the past, a debt I have finally cleared." Serafina took a slow, deliberate sip of water from a cracked tin mug. She felt the ghost of a laugh deep in her chest. Lucian believed he was the one settling accounts, yet he was currently eating off a table she owned, in a house she had secretly foreclosed upon, while being mocked by a woman who held his entire life in a ledger beneath her thumb. "Yes," she whispered, her eyes locking onto his with a predatory sharpness that made the Duke pause mid-breath. "The debts are being cleared, Lucian, sooner than you think." The silence that followed Lucian's departure was not empty. It was the coiled tension of a predator waiting for the snap of a dry twig. That snap came 48 hours later in the form of a frantic rider, his horse lathered in white foam, screaming for the Duke. But the Duke was miles away at the manor, celebrating his newfound freedom. It was Serafina who stood at the gates of the outpost, her arms crossed over her soot-stained bodice, watching the messengers panic with a chilling, quiet satisfaction. The Ravenshire mines, the beating heart of Lucian's wealth, had stopped beating. By noon, the news had rippled through the valley like a shockwave. 500 men had walked out of the shafts, dropping their picks and lanterns in the dark. They weren't asking for shorter hours or better ventilation. They were demanding the wages that had vanished from their pay packets. Lucian, in his infinite arrogance, had assumed his head of payroll was merely slow. He didn't know that the payroll company had been liquidated 3 weeks ago, and its assets folded into an anonymous firm headquartered in the very forge where Serafina now stood. Serafina climbed the hill overlooking the main supply road, her boots sinking into the red clay. From this vantage point, she could see the long line of ore wagons stalled at the mountain pass. Without the miners to dig and the teamsters to haul, the Duke's contracts with the Imperial Navy were being violated with every passing second. The penalties for those missed deadlines were written in blood, contracts she had personally reviewed and purchased through her network of disgraced clerks. The stakes had shifted from social embarrassment to total systemic collapse. If the iron didn't move by sunset, the king's auditors would descend upon Ravenshire Manor to seize the Duke's remaining assets for breach of crown contract. Down in the valley, she saw the glint of gold leaf. Lucian's carriage was tearing through the mud, heading toward the mines in a desperate attempt to quell the rebellion with threats and high-born bluster. He still believed his name carried weight. He still believed a snarl could command the starving. Serafina reached into her apron and pulled out a small, jagged piece of raw iron ore. She turned it over in her scarred hand, the metal cold and unyielding. She had stopped the flow of his lifeblood with a single stroke of a pen and a handful of well-placed bribes. Lucian was rushing to a fire he thought was a simple protest, unaware that the woman he had discarded had already cut the water lines and salted the earth. "Go on, Lucian," she whispered to the wind as the carriage disappeared into the dust. "Threaten them, scream at the mountain, see if the stone listens to a man who owns nothing." The descent into ruin was a frantic, sweating thing. Within 48 hours of the strike, the Duke's arrogance had been replaced by a feral, cornered desperation. Lucian sat in the back of his carriage, his fingers trembling as they traced the lines of his mounting liabilities. The Imperial Navy was threatening a treasonous breach of contract, his mistresses were demanding jewelry he could no longer afford, and his own house staff had begun to eye the silverware with predatory intent. There was only one option left, the Black Iron Bank. He arrived at the bank's satellite office, a cold, limestone building on the edge of the industrial district, looking every bit the disgraced sovereign. He didn't see the irony in the name, nor did he notice that the clerk behind the desk wore a suit of better quality than his own frayed military tunic. "I require a bridge loan," Lucian commanded, his voice cracking. £50,000. I have the Ravenshire crest as collateral." The clerk didn't even look up from his ledger. "The crest is already leveraged to its limit, Your Grace. However, our silent partner has authorized a discretionary fund for special cases, but the terms are absolute." Lucian didn't care for terms, he cared for survival. He signed the documents with a flourish of gold-nibbed ink, unaware that every stroke of his pen was a nail in his own coffin. He believed he was taking money from a faceless conglomerate of London financiers. He never suspected that the discretionary fund was composed of the very coins he had sent to Serafina as a pittance, multiplied by her shrewd acquisitions. Miles away, in the quiet chill of the outpost, Serafina sat by the dying embers of the forge. She held a duplicate of the contract Lucian was currently signing. She didn't need to see his face to know the exact moment the trap closed. By accepting the loan, Lucian had unknowingly granted the Blackstone Bank the right to immediate foreclosure upon a single missed shipment of ore, a shipment she had already ensured would never leave the mountain pass. She leaned back against the stone wall, the rough granite scratching through her thin bodice. For 3 years, she had lived in the shadow of his ego, a ghost haunting the edges of his grand life. Now, the shadows were shifting. She was no longer just the woman he had replaced, she was the architect of his bankruptcy. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows across the forge floor, Serafina felt a surge of cold, intoxicating power. Lucian thought he was borrowing time. In reality, he was selling her the very ground he stood on, piece by desperate piece. She closed the ledger and felt the weight of the £1,000,000 secret pressing against her chest. The Blackstone Bank wasn't a building in the city, it was the woman in the dirt, and she was about to call in the debt. The hunger at Ravenshire Manor was a quiet, dignified rot. By the time Lucian returned to the outpost, the gold braid on his shoulders had tarnished, and the arrogance in his stride had been replaced by a stiff-backed, hollow-eyed desperation. He did not arrive in a golden carriage this time. He arrived on a borrowed horse, his boots caked in the same red clay he had once looked upon with such profound disgust. Serafina was sitting at her scarred wooden table, a simple bowl of coarse bread and hard cheese set before her. The smell of the fresh loaf, baked with grain she had bought from the very merchants who had refused the Duke credit, wafted toward him like a taunt. "I am told your little garden patch has thrived while the valley harvests have failed," Lucian said, his voice straining to maintain a tone of bored authority. He didn't look at her, he looked at the bread. "A temporary administrative error has delayed the manor's supplies. I require a portion of your stores to maintain the household. I shall reimburse you tenfold, of course, once the king's auditors conclude their business." Serafina tore a piece of bread, the crust crackling in the silence. "The land is honest, Lucian. It does not recognize administrative errors, it only recognizes who tends to it." "Do not lecture me on husbandry, Serafina," he snapped, though the growl lacked its usual bite. "I am the Duke. By law, everything this land produces is mine. I am simply asking, as a formality, to spare you the indignity of a seizure." Serafina wiped her thumb against the grain of the table. "You want the bread of a ghost? Very well, but my laborers are tired of working for promises. I need a signature, a small, trivial thing to satisfy the village council's bylaws on the movement of grain." She pulled a single sheet of rough, yellowed paper from the folds of her apron. It was a messy, handwritten document, cluttered with local jargon and scribbled notes about bushels and bailiffs. To a man like Lucian, who dealt in imperial decrees and royal charters, it looked like a pathetic scrap of provincial bureaucracy. "More paperwork for your little pretend life?" Lucian sneered, grabbing the quill she offered. He didn't bother to read the cramped, smudged lines. He was a duke, and this was a woman he had replaced. He signed his name with a jagged, impatient flourish, the ink bleeding into the cheap fiber. "There, feed your counsel. Now have my men load the wagons." Serafina took the paper back, her fingers lingering on the wet ink. Lucian didn't notice the way her eyes darkened with a terrible, quiet joy. He didn't see the claws hidden beneath the meaningless grain tally, a clause that acknowledged the outpost as an independent sovereignty in exchange for the relief of the local famine. With that single, arrogant stroke of his pen, Lucian had not just traded bread for paper. He had signed away the legal jurisdiction of the very ground beneath his feet. He walked toward the stores, still believing he was taking what was his. Serafina watched his back, the meaningless paper clutched to her chest like a blade. The trap hadn't just closed, it had severed the limb. The sound of the Duke's carriage departing with his loan of grain was still echoing in the valley when the first cracks in the empire became a canyon. Lucian spent the evening in his study, drinking the last of the vintage brandy and boasting to Lady Alara about how he had managed his wife's provincial stubbornness. He felt the warmth of the alcohol and the false security of a full larder. The silence was shattered at dawn by the heavy, rhythmic thud of iron-shod boots on the marble floors of Ravenshire Manor. Not the servants, but men in the dark, practical livery of the Black Iron Trust. Lucian met them in the grand foyer, his silk robe billowed behind him like a tattered flag. "What is this insolence? I have just secured the grain to feed this household. Get out before I have you lashed." The lead bailiff did not flinch. He merely held up a single sheet of yellowed, rough paper, the meaningless grain tally Lucian had signed in the dirt of the outpost. "Your Grace," the bailiff said, his voice devoid of the usual tremor of a commoner in the presence of a duke. "By the authority of this document, you have acknowledged the outpost as an independent sovereign entity and transferred all secondary holdings, specifically this ancestral estate, as surety for the debt of the famine relief." Lucian's face went a sickly shade of grey. "That's impossible. It was a receipt for bread, a tally of bushels." "Read the fine print, Lucian," a new voice rang out, cutting through his panic like a blade. Serafina stood at the open oak doors, the morning light silhouetting her frame. She wasn't wearing silk. She was still in her soot-stained bodice and heavy boots, the coal dust still a shadow on her cheekbones. In her hand, she held the original ledger, its leather cover worn from the 3 years she had spent dismantling his life. "You never did have a head for the details," she said, stepping into the foyer. Her boots left a trail of red clay across the pristine white marble, the very mud he had told her to stay in. "The grain tally was a rider to a deed transfer. You signed away the manor, the grounds, and the very air in these hallways for a few wagons of salted fat and barley." Lucian lunged for the paper, but the bailiffs stepped forward, their pikes crossing in a sharp, metallic X. "The king's auditors have already ratified it," Serafina continued, her voice rising with a cold, intoxicating clarity. "You are no longer the master here, you are a guest of the Black Iron Trust, and as the majority shareholder, I find your presence redundant." She watched the realization hit him, the way his eyes darted from the paper to her scarred hands, finally seeing the predator he had mistaken for a ghost. The ancestral home, the medals, the history, it had all been traded for a meal he had already eaten. The empire hadn't just cracked, the foundation had been replaced with iron, and Serafina held the only key. The air in the grand hallway of Ravenshire Manor felt thin, as if the house itself were gasping. Lucian stood beneath the massive crystal chandelier, his chest heaving under the weight of his tarnished military tunic. Behind him, a line of 5 maids stood frozen, their hands pressed over their mouths in a wall of silent, gasping shock. They had watched him rule with a fist of iron for years, but now they watched him shatter. "You think this scrap of paper changes who I am?" Lucian snarled, his face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He took a predatory step forward, his finger stabbing the air inches from Serafina's face. "I plucked you from a dying house when you had nothing but a name and a few moth-eaten gowns. I built this empire, Serafina. I am the blood, and you are merely the shadow." He leaned in, his voice a low, vibrating hiss of venom. "I can replace you anytime. I have already done it. You are a decorative asset that has outlived its beauty, and I will have you dragged from this hallway in chains before I let a common blacksmith's whore claim my seat." Serafina didn't flinch. She leaned back against a marble pillar, her posture radiating a dangerous, stoic confidence. To the witnesses in the background, she looked like a lamb standing before a wolf, but her eyes held the predatory glint of a hunter who had already tripped the snare. She let a slow, amused smile spread across her face, a smile that didn't reach her cold, grey eyes. "You speak of empires, Lucian," she said, her voice calm and terrifyingly steady. "But an empire is more than a name on a gate. It is the gold in the vault, the iron in the ground, and the loyalty of the men who keep the fires burning. You have none of those things." With a deliberate, metallic clink, she reached into the hidden pocket of her work apron and withdrew the massive iron key she had forged in the midnight heat of the outpost. She held it aloft in the center of the frame, the phoenix thorn's crest catching the light of the dying afternoon sun. "You cannot replace me," she whispered, her smile sharpening into a blade. "Because you cannot replace the person who owns you. Look at your boots, Lucian. Look at the roof over your head. I didn't just manage your assets while you were busy in other women's beds. I bought them. Every debt you ran up, every acre you gambled away, I was the one on the other side of the table." She took a step toward him, forcing the Duke to instinctively recoil. "You told me to watch you. Well, Lucian, I am watching. And now, you can watch me burn your empire to the ground and build my own from the ash." The iron key felt heavy and absolute in her hand. For the first time in 3 years, the Duke was silent. His snarl had turned into a hollow, gaping mask of horror as he realized the woman he had discarded wasn't just holding a key, she was holding his life. The silence that followed Serafina's declaration was heavier than any shout. It was the sound of a vacuum, of a man's world collapsing into a single, suffocating point. Lucian looked at the iron key, then at the gasping maids, and finally at the wife he had called a ghost. For the first time, he saw her, not as a decorative asset or a discarded burden, but as the architect of his extinction. He did not go quietly, but he went without power. The king's guard, led by a commander whose brother had been saved from debtor's prison by Serafina's anonymous hand, stepped forward. They did not bow to the Duke. They placed their hands on his shoulders and guided him toward the doors. There was no violence, only the cold, administrative efficiency of a foreclosure. Serafina climbed the grand marble staircase, her heavy boots clicking a steady, rhythmic beat that drowned out Lucian's fadding protests. She reached the mahogany balcony that overlooked the estate's sweeping drive. Below, the golden carriage he had arrived in was gone, replaced by a simple, unmarked black coach. She watched as Lucian was ushered inside. He looked small from this height, a frantic, gold-braided insect stripped of its sting. He looked up once, his face a pale moon of disbelief, but Serafina did not wave. She did not gloat. She simply stood with her hands resting on the stone balustrade, the soot-stained fabric of her sleeves fluttering in the wind. As the carriage pulled away, disappearing into the mist that clung to the iron-rich hills, Serafina felt the final thread of the Vilcrest Ravenshire union snap. She didn't just want him gone, she wanted him forgotten. Tomorrow, the Ravenshire name would be stripped from the gates. The crest would be melted down in her forge and recast into the tools of a new industry. The ghost duchess was dead, and in her place stood a woman who had turned her exile into an empire. She looked out over the valley, where the fires of the forge were beginning to roar once more. The iron was hot, the debts were paid, and for the first time in her life, the air she breathed was entirely her own. She had burned his world to the ground, and from the ashes, she would build something that could never be replaced. Watch the embers fade and the new empire rise. Subscribe for more tales of the ultimate comeuppance and the women who turn the world to ash.